This video will unveil the secrets of how to one frame flick. Just as important as the how to one frame, we're also going to cover things like settings, which is equally important. And although there are many great guides out there as it is, what I'll be sharing with you today hasn't been previously touched on. Before we get into that, let's answer the question: what is a one frame flick? To answer that, let's start with something you're already familiar with. Here, we're taking a look at the player accelerate. Now, this is a very smooth multi-kill, there's no denying that, but what we're paying attention to is ultimately the flicks themselves. Notice how the travel time and the distance, notice how the flicks are connected. And as we take a look at one of my clips, the difference is night and day. Notice how my crosshair teleports from A to B. So in short, a one frame flick is simply a really fast flick within a single frame. But this does raise the question, which technique is better? There is a way to objectively measure this, so we will cover that, but there are other things that we need to get to first. So how do you one frame flick? Simply lift the mouse from your mouse pad, followed by slamming it back down onto the surface and in the direction you want to one frame. To practice this, find something on the map that you're currently on to flick onto. Practice flicking between multiple targets, however, change the angle in which you approach those targets. If multiple targets is too many targets, don't be afraid to just pick one. After a few minutes, start incorporating mechanics that are commonly used within your game of choice. Here in Halo Infinite, I'm practicing doing a repulsor jump, attempting to hit as many targets as I can before my feet hit the ground. Here in Overwatch, I'm practicing flicking to the target initially, but then I want to continue to track the target for a period of time after. Back to Call of Duty, slide canceling is a huge part of that meta, so coming out of the slide cancel, I'm practicing flicking onto a target outside of my field of view. Next, as it pertains to settings, there are three components at play. To begin this segment, let's have a discussion about polling rate. What you're taking a look at is the difference or comparison between a rate of 125 versus 1000 and 8000. The reason for this comparison is because many people within the one frame flicking community will often recommend the polling rate of 125. And if you know, a polling rate of 125 has been outdated for many years. So the question is, why 125? Let's take a closer look here. Can you tell the difference between a rate of 125 versus 1000? The answer is no, or at least mostly no. Because the video you're watching right now is rendered at 60 frames per second, the difference in polling rate is going to be mostly imperceptible. Perhaps this implies that polling rate doesn't actually matter to begin with, but that is simply false. Polling rate drastically changes how your one frames feel and interact from your perspective. If I were you, I would consider maybe taking some time to experiment with different polling rate, although it's not mandatory. Next, let's cover sensitivity. In general, I have found that a high sensitivity absolutely makes this technique a lot easier. Here I'm playing on a much slower sense of approximately 60 centimeters per 360. Notice my flicks fall short every time. That's not to say it can't be done though, so if you prefer a slow sensitivity, don't let that stop you from trying. And finally, I think the most impactful setting possible. And to my surprise, for how vital and crucial this is to the success of this technique, I have yet to find anyone talk about this in any meaningful way. This vital piece of the puzzle, this setting, is liftoff distance. After hundreds of hours of experimentation with a low, medium, and a high, and those are of course general terms, I strongly encourage you that if you're going to pick any one setting to test, this would have to be it. In no way am I suggesting that you headcase over this, but let's say you've attempted this technique in the past and it just didn't feel quite right. This setting could very well be a factor, but is this technique actually worth pursuing? You may be surprised by what you see. Let's revisit Accelerate's clip one more time. We are specifically looking at this segment here. Counting the total number of frames it took for Accelerate to flick from A to B, I counted a total of 20 frames. Let's now take a look at my clip. I counted a single frame to go from A to B, but that is simply not the entire picture. If you include the number of frames it takes once I begin to lift the mouse, because that's obviously necessary to initiate the flick, the difference between the two really isn't all that much different, but comparing two clips alone simply isn't enough. I decided to gather more data to determine which technique is actually better. As part of my data collection, I also wanted to include other players, so I decided to look at two different clips from the player Miss Colors, two clips from Active, and an additional clip from Accelerate. accelerate. My initial comparison of counting every frame going A to B remains the same. Here is what I found. When I lump all these players together, accelerate, active, and miss colors, the average amount of frames it took for them to flick from A to B was a total of 13.7 frames. This was the average of the 6 clips that I looked at. For a fair comparison, I needed a total of 6 clips as well. The average frames for my 6 clips was a total of 12.8. So while it's technically true that one framing is faster, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually better. For example, notice that I'm lifting my mouse here. Take note of the fact that my target that I'm shooting at isn't actually dead. This means that I have to preemptively lift my mouse before my target is even dead to prepare for the next target. If for any reason at all my target decides to do something unpredictable, the likelihood that I could survive the encounter becomes less likely. When we take a look at Viscos, for example, she's one of the greatest aimers in the world, if not the greatest. We can see, of course, she's using the traditional flicking technique. The amount of frame time it takes for her to go from A to B is so insignificant. It does make you kind of take a step back and think a little bit. Is one framing worth it when you could instead spend more time practicing your traditional flick? All I'm doing is handing you all the information and simply allowing you to make a choice for yourself.
I reported that guy.